In the grim darkness of the far past, there is only war, and so you're going to need gods of war, and as it turns out, goddesses of war as well. I wanted to take a quick break from our regular study of the Hebrew Bible itself to talk about one of the deities that we encounter in the world of the ancient Hebrew scriptures, namely the goddess Astarte. This goddess enjoyed a long pedigree, being worshipped in very ancient times and continuing to be worshipped by various cults well into the Hellenistic period and into early Christianity. But throughout that time, what Astarte was and what she meant varied a lot from the various people groups and cults that worshipped her. So we're going to take a quick survey of those today and examine their importance to the text of the Hebrew Bible as well. Now, first and foremost, I should note that the name Astarte refers to an ancient Near Eastern goddess who was worshipped throughout a lot of the ancient Near East and a lot of the Mediterranean world. When I first heard about Astarte, I assumed that her name was Greek and derived from the Greek word for star, Aster. As it turns out, the name Astarte is actually a Greek rendering of an older Semitic name Ashtoreth, or other varieties along those lines. As it turns out, this goddess's name actually had a variety of pronunciations depending on who you were and where you were, so I'm just going to read these off directly. At the city of Ugarit, the northernmost Phoenician city-state, she was pronounced as Atharet. In the Phoenician city-states themselves, she was pronounced as Ashtaret. In the Hebrew Bible, she is pronounced Ashtaret or Ashtarot for plural, which we'll get to later. In Egypt, she was transliterated as Astharet, Asthareth, and Istharet. And in Greek, that was translated into Astarte. As I already mentioned, Astarte was primarily a Semitic goddess, and as a result, she shows up in most Semitic cultures in the ancient world, both East and West. The fact that Astarte was worshipped by both Western Semitic people and Eastern Semitic people suggests that the worship of Astarte actually began before the early Semitic people groups diverged between East and West. So common Old Semitic or Old Central Semitic people probably worshipped Astarte in some form or another. As the people of the Semitic peoples went west, they carried the cult of Astarte with them, whereas the people who went east pronounced it a little bit differently. Ishtar, the famous goddess of Babylon and Assyria, who was ultimately of the same descent as Astarte. As I mentioned earlier, the goddess Astarte enjoyed a very long pedigree. The evidence of her worship goes all the way back to the ancient city of Ebla, which is a Semitic city-state in the western part of the Semitic world, which was destroyed under the reign of Naram-Sin in the 2300s BC. We also find evidence of her worship at the nearby cities of Ugarit and Imar. The western city of Ugarit on the coast of the Mediterranean, her worship was present but subordinated to the worship of her sister Anat. Whereas at Imar, it was primarily Astarte who was worshipped, and Anat came second to her. At the city of Mari in western Mesopotamia, the goddess Ishtar was worshipped there, but her name was pronounced as something closer to Astarte, Atharet, things of that nature, which suggests that the Mariote peoples who lived between the East and the West Semitic worlds were aware of the fact that Ishtar in the East and Astarte in the West were two sides of the same coin, to some degree or another. As referenced by the Bible, Astarte was also worshipped by the Canaanite population of the Promised Land, so she enjoyed patronage not only in the East and West, but further south along the coast of the Mediterranean, getting towards Egyptian territory. There's also references to the worship of Astarte on the sarcophagi of certain kings of the Phoenician city of Sidon, specifically Tabnet and Eshmanezer, both of whom suggest that the royal family of the city of Sidon were part of the royal cult of Astarte, and who were also the patrons of her temple in that city. Finally, all the way in the 2nd century AD, well into Roman times, the author Lucian of Samosata, a native of the Roman province of Syria, wrote a document called On the Syrian Goddess. It's also possible somebody else wrote this. It's typically included with Lucian's writings, but some have suggested that it's a pseudepigraphon or simply mistakenly attributed to Lucian. But nevertheless, the document commonly attributed to Lucian, called On the Syrian Goddess, or De Dea Syria, refers to the worship of the Syrian goddess Atargatis. Atargatis seems to be a late derivation of the goddess Ishtar or Astarte, with the name Astarte being shortened to Athtar, and the suffix gaddis being appended onto this. And if this is the case, then it suggests that the worship of Astarte extends from the time period attested by Ebla, which was destroyed around 2300 BC, all the way to the 2nd century AD, which, just taking those extremes, gives us a time period of at least 2,500 years, with possibly more time before and after both of them. So we're dealing with a goddess who stuck around in this part of the world for a very long time, and who survived cultural change under rulers like Babylonians, Assyrians, Israelites, Egyptians, Romans, Persians, and several others besides. When it comes to actually identifying the attributes and the functions of Astarte, we find a very similar figure to Ishtar in the east of the Semitic world, which makes sense since they're both derivations of the same Old Semitic deity. Iconography associated with Astarte, similar to that associated with Ishtar, presents the goddess as being mounted on top of a lion. There is also some evidence from Egypt of Astarte being mounted on top of a horse, but we're going to get to that in a second here. The lion mount is the primary mode of representation that we see Astarte represented as standing upon. In the Semitic world, and pretty much uniquely within the Semitic world, except for some exceptions in Hurrian and Hittite depictions, it was common to depict deities as standing on top of a very particular cult icon. For Baal and El, this was usually a bovine of some sort or another, but every time that we see Astarte in the west or Ishtar in the east, it's almost always on top of a lion, that or on top of some mythical dragon creature in Eastern depictions of Ishtar, which were common to most deities. Although in some depictions we do find Astarte mounted on top of a horse, and this is largely in Egyptian representations of the, to them, foreign goddess Astarte. This has to do with the importation of the cult of Astarte from the Phoenician and Canaanite world to Egypt, at which point Astarte became the patron goddess of the Egyptian war machine with regard to its cavalry and its chariots. This was a super important role because chariots and cavalry were the imperial fist of the Egyptian army at this time, during the New Kingdom period when they were expanding dramatically. It was also common to see Astarte and Ishtar represented as holding bows and arrows, sometimes in combat positions or hunting positions, and sometimes giving them to recipients, usually kings or other important priestly figures. And this checks out because when we come to Astarte's functions within narrative and cult, we see here she's closely associated not so much with warfare outside of Egyptian appropriation of Astarte, but primarily with hunting. In fact, in cults from Imar, Ugarit, and the Aramaean city-states, we see the constant worship of Astarte in connection to her function as a hunting goddess. Again, when the Egyptians imported Astarte, she became the patroness of warfare through the form of chariots and equine combat. But again, in the earlier Canaanite and Phoenician settings, we don't really see a whole lot of reference to this, so it seems likely that that's an Egyptian augmentation of Astarte's role. However, if she came to Egypt recognized as a hunting warrior, and given that bows are often used in depictions of Egyptian kings on campaign, it could be that the Egyptians took this as an indication that she was also a war goddess, where in reality, the Canaanite and Phoenician war goddess was Anat. There is some very slight indication that Astarte was considered a fertility goddess, but honestly, there isn't a whole lot of information supporting this. Some suggest that Astarte is represented in the votive clay figures that we find scattered across a lot of the ancient Near East, everywhere from Sumer all the way down to Egypt. These were tiny votive figurines ostensibly offered to goddesses of fertility that stood as human requests for fertility for themselves, mothers wishing to give birth to daughters, and so they would pray to the goddess of fertility. Although, when it comes to identifying Astarte with the recipient of these figurines, or as represented by these figurines, there's not a whole lot of solid evidence to support this. There is the fact that in the East, Ishtar, the Eastern derivation of Astarte, was considered a goddess of procreation and childbirth. But it should be noted that the goddess Ishtar, part of the Eastern Semitic world, was merged with the native Sumerian goddess Inanna, whose role was the birth of children and bearing of children. And so it's possible that this emerged not from a core attribute of Astarte herself, but rather from the combination of Astarte with Inanna in the figure of Ishtar in the East. And if that happened in the East, there's no guarantee that it would have happened in the West. Although it is interesting that within the Hebrew Bible itself, there are 4 references that use the word Ashtoreth, which seems to be related somehow to Ashtorot, the Hebrew word for Astarte, and it always, in all 4 of its occurrences, all of which are in the book of Deuteronomy, it always refers to the fertility specifically of goat herds, that is, the ability for goats to reproduce and bear more offspring. It's possible that this is just a coincidence, that this word happens to look like Ashtaroth, but it is also possible that Astarte or Ashtaroth's position as a goddess of hunting also led to her reverence as a goddess of fertility of hunted animals, that including wild game and possibly similar animals like caprids. If that's the case, then it is possible that Astarte was worshipped as a fertility goddess, but if that's the case, it probably wasn't human fertility, so much as it was the fertility of, again, the hunted game that Astarte was patroness of, and possibly also herds of tame animals in the form of goats and other caprids. As for Astarte's relationship to the other gods in the Canaanite and Phoenician pantheon, not a lot is known from the ancient texts. A lot of older publications would say that she was the spouse of Baal or El, and it's really only circumstantial evidence that suggests that she had any definitive relation to either of these, or anyone else for that matter. There is information from Punic, Aramaic, and late Hellenistic Phoenician material that associates Astarte as the spouse of Baal. And while these are very late compared to the earlier material that we would prefer and that we frankly don't have in referencing their marriage, it is interesting that these are very far-flung ideas and cultures, suggesting that they didn't just draw from one common source. So for instance, the Punic world is in the west in Carthage, the Aramaean world is in modern-day Syria, and Hellenistic period Phoenician memories may be genuine memories of earlier Phoenician ideas that just aren't otherwise recorded. So it's possible that Astarte was considered in some circles to be the spouse of Baal. She did share a temple with Baal at Ugarit, but it's not entirely clear that that's the case. We don't have any text definitively saying that's what's going on here. It is pretty clear that she was considered to be the daughter of El, the high god of the Phoenician and Canaanite pantheon, since that shows up in several Phoenician texts as well as broader syncretistic texts like those in Egypt. Now, you read the thumbnail of the title of this video correctly when I said Astartes. What do I mean by that? And by that I mean Astartes plural. There seem to have been more than one Astarte. Now this phenomenon shows up also with other gods like Baal, El, and even in some cases Yahweh. Basically, the ancients had a very geographically centered view of ancient deities. You had a deity who manifests themselves at one particular place as opposed to being manifest through all of creation. Most people consider the gods of the ancient world to be confined, relatively speaking, geographically. And so if Baal manifested himself in the city of Tyre and also the city of Sidon, you would call his manifestation at Tyre Baal of Tyre, whereas the manifestation at Sidon is Baal of Sidon. It's the same deity, but manifesting himself in different places with different primary and executive functions. This even happens again with the Israelite god Yahweh in the Kuntilit Ajrud inscriptions dating to the 8th century BC, wherein the author blesses his friend by Yahweh of Samaria and Yahweh of Teman, referring to a mountain south of ancient Israel. These are references to the same deity, but only insofar as they're manifest at different points. Basically, he's saying, I bless you by the Yahweh who's in the city in the north and the mountain in the south, perhaps referencing either his geography, being as far north or south as one could imagine, or perhaps there's a particular power in the urban nature of Yahweh's manifestation at Samaria and his rural manifestation in the mountain. Scholars debate these points, but the point being one deity could be imagined as manifest in multiple different areas. So when we have references to multiple Astartes, is that what's meant? And actually, no. This seems to be a unique situation where multiple Astartes doesn't refer to multiple different manifestations of the same deity, but rather is a reference to multiple different deities who all seem to share the name Astarte or the title Astarte, but who are different personalities. The reason we think that is the primary reference to multiple Astartes comes from a Neo-Assyrian Akkadian cylinder seal from western Mesopotamia. And in this text, it worships Anat, a distinct goddess who is related to Astarte but not identical with her, as the greatest among the Astartes. Now, had this reference the Astarte of Mari or the Astarte of Nineveh as greatest among the Astartes, then perhaps we could say that there's one Astarte who's manifesting herself in different places, and thus they can be sort of compiled against one another somehow. But instead we get Anat, a totally separate deity, or at least a closely associated deity who's nevertheless a different personality, who's called one of the Astartes, and the greatest of them, to be totally frank. So that suggests that the term Astarte, at least by the Neo-Assyrian time period, had become a generic term for a goddess. This isn't actually the only time that this happens. I mentioned a little while ago that the chief head of the Canaanite and Phoenician pantheon was named El. As time went on, the name El simply became the generic term for a god. Baal is considered an El. Asherah is considered an El or an Elah. And we even find in the Hebrew Bible the God of Israel, who's supposed to be totally distinct from other deities, referred to as an El Shaddai or El Saphon, so on and so forth. So we get the idea that a primary name for a deity can become genericized at a later time, especially if it's a particularly popular deity. And that seems to have happened with Astarte. Just as El started out as a singular deity who later broke out into multiple, or whose name was later used, rather, as a title for a generic deity, so too did Astarte likely begin as a very particular goddess, and then later on the term Astarte came to be used as a title for generic goddess rather than a definitive use of the name in reference to the person Astarte, although the worship of Astarte did indeed continue long after this time. I mentioned that Astarte was worshipped in both Phoenicia and Canaan, and this was especially the case when the Israelites started to move into Canaan and the biblical narrative continues. It seems that by the time the Israelite population arrived in Canaan, there was already a large Canaanite cult to Astarte, although its centralization isn't exactly given. It seems to have been widely dispersed throughout the land. Now, although the Israelites were called to worship God specifically, Yahweh, the God of Israel and the God of the Bible, nevertheless, a lot of the Israelites wound up worshiping the old Canaanite gods like El, Asherah, Baal, and Astarte. And so Astarte shows up in the Bible several times as an example of a deity who isn't meant to be worshipped. In fact, sometimes she shows up in the plural, the Astartes, or the Ashtaroth, which suggests that already by the biblical times there was this recognition of multiple goddesses who were called the Astartes. Nevertheless, the goddess Astarte was likely involved in this cultic worship by the Israelites. A specific goddess named Astarte, known as Astarte of Sidon, so probably the proper Astarte and not a generic goddess, the worship of Astarte of Sidon was implemented, of all places, in the Jerusalem temple by King Solomon in the book of 1 Kings, alongside a variety of other pagan gods that Solomon wasn't supposed to worship. And this is a suggestion that Astarte was worshipped by the formal cult of Israel throughout the united and especially the divided monarchy of ancient Israel. Of course, the worship of Astarte was banned by King Josiah at the tail end of the Judahite monarchy during the divided monarchy period, where he purged the temple of Israel from the worship of all foreign deities except for the local deity Yahweh, who is the God of Israel and again the God of the Bible. And that's all we have for Astarte today. I was just doing some research on Astarte and the gods and goddesses of Canaan and Israel behind the scenes and just wanted to make a quick video on this. If everybody likes it enough, and if I find more in my research, I could always make a sequel, an Astartes 2 perhaps, potentially coming in 2026, but that would be asking a lot. So hope everybody really enjoyed. We'll get back to you with your regularly scheduled content soon. Have a great day.